My uncle and I were on a trip to the heart of Transylvania, a place known for its rich history and, of course, its association with the legendary Dracula. My aunt had always been fascinated by the lore of vampires and castles, so we decided to embark on this journey, hoping to find the perfect vacation home for her in the region. We scoured the countryside, exploring quaint villages and charming towns, until we stumbled upon a centuries-old mansion nestled in the Carpathian Mountains. It was a grand, eerie structure, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to be perpetually shrouded in mist. We immediately fell in love with it, and the decision was made. My aunt would buy this castle, and it would be her new venture, turning it into a unique and spooky tourist attraction. The process of acquiring the property was anything but straightforward. Our real estate agent warned us about potential fraudsters in the region, and she was right. As we were finalizing the deal, a man who claimed to be a property inspector approached us, offering to expedite the paperwork for a fee. Trusting him, my aunt handed over 15,000 Romanian lei. As you can probably guess, that man vanished into thin air, and our dream quickly turned into a nightmare. It became clear that we had been defrauded, and we needed help. That's when the locals suggested we report the incident to the Romanian police, who were reputed to be highly efficient and helpful. Having heard wonderful things about the Romanian police, my aunt decided to take the matter into her own hands and headed to the nearest police station. The station was a somber, imposing building, and we were met with long queues and a lot of bureaucratic confusion. The language barrier didn't help either. My aunt couldn't speak Romanian. For hours, we were shuffled from one counter to another, each officer seemingly as lost as the last. My aunt's patience was wearing thin, and she was on the brink of giving up when, finally, she was summoned to the 4th floor. There, in a dimly lit room, she encountered an officer who seemed to be in charge of her case. Frustration boiled within her as she snatched the papers from his hand, her face contorted in irritation. She realized her mistake immediately and apologized profusely, but it was already too late. The officer, perhaps nursing a bruised ego, suddenly turned hostile. Accusations were flung at her, ranging from fighting and abuse to paper throwing. The officer's senseless allegations left my aunt bewildered and terrified. She was summarily thrown into a prison cell for a day, her cries of innocence falling on deaf ears. The prison was a grim place, filled with the sounds of inmates' agonized screams, a place that haunted her every waking moment. After a nightmarish day behind bars, she was released, but the nightmare was far from over. She went back to the officer, and with a heavy heart, she apologized again. The officer handed her a document in Arabic and asked her to sign it, assuring her it would resolve her troubles. She complied, not knowing what she was getting into. Thinking she was free, my aunt proceeded to catch her scheduled flight out of Romania. To her shock, she was told that a case was pending against her, preventing her from leaving the country. Desperate and fearing the worst, she sought the assistance of several lawyers, only to learn that no case had been filed, leaving them powerless to help. With no other option, she returned to the police station, where they finally acknowledged the case had been registered. She repeatedly apologized to the same officer, who now claimed to have forgiven her. He suggested she seek resolution through the public prosecutor, marking yet another step in this never-ending ordeal. It took 15 agonizing days to reach the office of the public prosecutor. She shared her story honestly, expecting a fair and just resolution. However, the prosecutor, too, wasn't worth pursuing and promised to speak to the officer about closing it. Hope had returned to our family, but it was short-lived. The next day, the officer was livid that the prosecutor had been involved, and his tone changed drastically. He was no longer the person who had appeared forgiving. He accused my aunt of betraying his trust by sharing the whole story. The case went to trial, and my aunt was found guilty, sentenced to a hefty fine. We accepted the punishment and paid the fine, believing this nightmare would soon be behind us. But it was not to be. 12 days after the verdict, the prosecutor unexpectedly increased the fine, added prison time, and demanded deportation, as relayed to us by our embassy. We were left with no choice but to appeal the decision in the High Court, desperately hoping for a fair resolution. However, our appeal was rejected. With no other option, we submitted an application to the Supreme Court, clinging to the hope that justice would eventually prevail. 6 months of my aunt's life had been consumed by this ordeal. She continued to struggle, working tirelessly at her salon to support her family, while her hard-earned money was draining away in legal fees and living expenses. She had 2 young children back in Sweden whom she hadn't seen in months, and the prospect of 3 months in prison loomed ominously on the horizon. Our family was at a breaking point, and we clung to the belief that someone, somewhere, could help us escape the nightmarish grip of this Kafkaesque ordeal. These were truly trying times for us, and we prayed for a glimmer of hope in the darkness that surrounded us.